after the news at 8:30. We're going to return now, just look back a little to the Assembly elections just over a month ago. Did you vote? And if not, why not? And would you have done if you were forced to? This is a question that's being mulled by the UK government. Should we all be compelled to vote in Assembly elections? During a House of Commons debate on the Wales Bill, which will give more powers to the National Assembly, Welsh Secretary Alan Cairn said AMs could introduce compulsory voting. So is that the best way to boost turnout? Yes, says Joe Stevens, Labour MP for Cardiff Central. Jonathan Edwards, Plaid Cymru MP for Carmarthen East and Dinefwr, not so sure. Good morning, both.
Morning.
And
Morning,
yes, Joe Stevens, you like the sound of this?
Yeah, I've always been a fan of compulsory voting. I consider it it's a bit like jury service. You know, it's your duty as a citizen, and provided there are options for people who, don't want to choose a particular party or can just turn up and register the fact that they've arrived at the ballot box and not registered to vote, then I'd be in favour of it.
And what's wrong with that idea, Jonathan Edwards?
Well, I think as any true Democrat will be concerned about the levels of voting in elections. However, I think, if we look at the underlying reasons for that, what we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years is a political strategy by all the main London parties here, following what happens in the United States, of what they call political triangulation. And essentially what that means is political parties converging on the same ground, and then as voter turnouts decline, targeting what they call super voters, the people who vote all the time. And because of that, there's no surprise really that voting turnouts have fallen, because the base supports of those parties increasingly feel alienated. And the result of that is what we're seeing at the moment, of course. The very worrying rise of the phenomenon of what they call post-truth politics. Now, I'm not entirely convinced. This is the first time I came across the idea of compulsory voting in a Welsh context yesterday, when Labour MPs seemed to be very keen on the idea during the debate yesterday, and the powers will be there now in the Wales Bill. We know there's 12 countries across the world that do it. Australia is probably the most famous. But we're talking about a major change in terms of moving voting from a civic right to a civic duty, and I'm not entirely convinced that's the way to do it. What we should be looking at is electoral reform. I think that's a necessity in terms of moving forward. In the system we got in Wales, first past the post is a very rotten political system. In Wales we've got an element of PR, but still one party in Wales gets 50% of the seats in the Assembly and only 30% of the vote. And that's the sort of thing we need to look at, which would then encourage political parties not to converge on the centre and pursue this very damaging, triangulating political strategy. I think that's the way to deal with this issue, rather than forcing people to do something.
You've told us, Joe Stevens, about how it might work, but what would it achieve?
Well,
compulsory voting.
Just to address what Jonathan is saying about this triangulation point, if everybody did vote or was required to vote, then there'd be much more pressure on politicians and political parties to represent all citizens and not just to narrow their campaigns at particular segments of voters. So the fears that Jonathan has, I think, would be dealt with it by having compulsory voting. And we've seen turnout in elections go down and down and down since the war. In the Assembly elections recently, there's only 45% turnout. And I think that decisions made by democratically elected governments are more legitimate when you've got a higher proportion of the population participating.
Well, yes, that goes without saying. But if what you're trying to achieve is public engagement in the political process, do you not think that forcing people to do something may switch even more people off? People don't like being forced to do things, do they?
Well, the system that I'm advocating is that everybody is required to go to the polling station, and they can either vote for a particular candidate in a party, or you could have a box that says none of the above, or you can have what Australia has, which is you're just required to go to the polling station and register that you've attended, and then you don't actually have to put a mark on a ballot paper. And Australia's had this system for nearly 100 years. Belgium has had mandatory voting laws for over 100 years, and both of those operate perfectly effectively.
And what do they do to people who don't turn up?
Well, in Australia, you have a £20 fine, which you can challenge if you've got a valid reason for not being able to vote, or you decide you're not going to pay the fine. If there's a valid reason, then nothing further happens. If there's no valid reason, you can be taken to court and the fine increases to $180. But their turnout is obviously much, much higher. And, they do sort of gimmicks at polling stations where you can go and have, they offer food, they offer hot dogs, all sorts of things, just to try and get people engaged and more educated about politics and the decision-making process in their country.
I guess what it might do, Jonathan Edwards, is turn the whole thing into even more of an event, a national occasion. And especially if you're doing things, as Joe Stevens was suggesting there, of making it a pleasant experience.
Well, I can understand the argument being put forward by Jo, and I'm glad that she also probably shares my view that we need to move away from this politics of triangulation where there's been convergence, just targeting a very narrow segment of the population, and that's good to hear. But I think the way to do it is to introduce electoral reform, and then that would enable a wider variety of parties. You move away from this business of a two-party state where there's a coalition within those parties, a realignment of politics. It'll be a far healthier style of politics where every vote counts. The turnouts I've had in Carmarthen East, for instance, where there's a very hotly contested seat, are far higher than the UK and the Welsh averages. And the reason why the turnouts are always far higher in my constituency is because both ourselves and the Labour Party and the Conservative Party actually work very hard in that constituency. Now, I think it's up to politicians to take a bit of responsibility here. Rather than placing a duty on people, it's our duty as the political class to convince people to vote for us.
But don't you
and
think,
certainly
Jonathan,
I think that's the way to go, rather than placing a civic duty on people and a level of compulsion.
Yeah, but don't you think, Jonathan, that if MPs had the prospect of their constituents going to the ballot box and voting for none of the above, and none of the above actually got the most votes, it would make them try a bit harder. And you and I know there are plenty of our colleagues across the House of Commons, I'm not going to say individuals or parties, who don't make as much effort as others. And maybe if you had that sort of system, it might push them to do so.
Yeah, I think that's a genuine reflection of first past the post, because we know within the UK system that effectively the UK election is determined by around 100 odd seats down here in the southeast of England, and that's why the political parties converge on the interests of this part of the UK and neglect everybody else.
Oh, no, not necessarily.
The way to change that is electoral reform, and I think I've got a lot of time for a lot of politicians in the Labour Party. Peter Hain, for instance, has seen this for a number of years, and there was a big opportunity, I think, following the 2010 general election, where there was an opportunity there to radically change the electoral system and underpin and realign politics with a PR system. Unfortunately, the Lib Dems, which had that opportunity, decided to go in with the Tories, and the rest is history.
Thank you both. We've got to move on to other matters, but thank you very much. Jonathan Edwards, the